So I want to introduce the topic of this symposium. How do I move the, is there a clicker? Ah, that's right. Clearly nervous. Okay, so know thyself, familiar phrase. This was a maxim in ancient Greek culture, along with sayings like everything in moderation. It had a variety of meanings. For example, it figured prominently in the story of Prometheus, the god who gave human beings fire. Zeus punished him for this, and when it was said to Prometheus, know thyself, it meant know thy place, know your place. But the phrase is often associated with Socrates, an ancient Greek philosopher. The Delphic oracle said that Socrates was the wisest man in all of Athens, and he was very puzzled by this because he felt that he didn't know the things that were most important to him, like what virtue is and what justice is. But then he lighted on the idea that, well, lots of people don't know what virtue is or justice, but he also knew that he didn't know, and so that must be why he was considered wise. Because he knew that he didn't know, that gave him motivation to investigate, and so it made it possible for him to come to know. And as you might know, this attitude led him to go around the streets asking people what virtue and justice are, drawing out their views in dialogue, and inevitably exposing that, on reflection, their assumptions didn't pan out either. And this practice that he had was particularly embarrassing for people called sophists. These were people who considered themselves educators and took fees from young men in order to teach them virtue, and also to teach them how to make weak arguments look stronger, from which we have the derogatory word sophistry. These were the originals. Socrates and Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, were contemporaries. And Socrates contrasted what the sophists were doing with what you would have if you studied with Hippocrates. With him, you would learn medicine. You would have knowledge and a skill. But Socrates thought that virtue was not a subject matter of this sort, and that, in fact, it couldn't be taught. Nevertheless, he thought that reflection that was motivated by the knowledge that you don't know would literally make us better people. So, this skill of asking and investigating that Socrates taught by example was threatening, not just to sophists, but to the established order. I mean, after all, what would the world come to if young people had the will and the skill to question what they were taught? So as you might know, Socrates was put on trial and executed for the charge of corrupting the youth. History has treated Socrates more kindly, and we remember him as giving us what's called the Socratic Method, where you draw out and examine your assumptions, and you learn through dialogue and not merely by being lectured to. So this is all very heady and ethical sounding, but you can know of yourself more than that you don't know, and more than what you might think virtue is. And there's a repeated theme over the millennia in the West that knowing yourself is a good thing, that it can help you gain knowledge of the world and of other people. In the 1530s, know thyself was a phrase used to explain why we should do dissection of human cadavers. So this would be human beings knowing human beings in the physical sense. What's the difference between knowing yourself and knowing something else? Well, you can think of it geometrically. A person can turn her gaze to the world, something else, as in when one knows two, or one knows three, or the gaze can be turned toward yourself, as when one knows one. But this gets complicated pretty quickly, because sometimes, for one to know one, she has to look at herself as if she were two or three, so as it were in a mirror. We might think that if self-knowledge is good, then more is better. But actually, not necessarily. Without my even asking, Ocado, the online grocery store, will tell me when was the last time I bought oatmeal. Now that's interesting. You can tell me all sorts of things like that. But it's actually not something I need to know. What I need to know is whether there's oatmeal in the cupboard. And actually that's not in the database that the program draws on. I also need to know my shoe size in order to buy shoes, but of course what my size is not an important matter. There are things that are important, like it's kind of important that I have a pulse and that it have a good rate, but I'm not sure that having that information about myself in real time was worth the price of the Fitbit. Although it's pink, it's kind of cute. In another kind of case, it's available to me to get genetic testing to figure out whether I have a gene for Huntington's disease, for example. And this is consequential. It's going to make a difference to the trajectory of my life. But actually, it's not at all clear that this additional information is something I want to know. That would depend. It's not just obvious. There's another way in which more self-knowledge or self-reflection might not be better, since it might not necessarily empower you to improve yourself. So you can have knowledge of the end, that you want to correct some trait that you have, and that doesn't necessarily give you knowledge of the means of doing it. And the two together don't necessarily give you the willpower or the self-control to bring that about. Also, self-knowledge in the form of self-consciousness in the colloquial sense could even interfere with trying to improve your situation. For example, that could make it hard to overcome social anxiety. In fact, it's part of what social anxiety consists in. And surely, you could assiduously apply your thought to yourself, think about yourself, reflect, and so on, and come to mistaken conclusions. So just thinking about yourself doesn't mean that you have self-knowledge. Finally, it seemed to many philosophers, and also to common sense, that there are some things that we know more easily and better than other people could. Examples are our own thoughts and how our bodies feel from the inside. We're surely the authority on these. But there's a complication here, too. Sometimes our mind hides our motivations from us, and other people can see them even more easily than we can. So who's the authority here? And also, obviously, the subvisible physical disease processes that may be causing your pain are not something you're necessarily the best authority on. You might have to go to a medical professional. And sometimes a mentally ill person is the last to know, because some illnesses can ruin self-perception. Okay, so sometimes when it's really important, knowledge of ourselves is hard to get. Sometimes self-knowledge is important but not helpful, or useful but not important. In some cases, it's important and easy to find out, but not necessarily something we want to know. So, as you might gather, the topics we're going to have in this symposium have to do with the complications, the consequences, the value or lack of value of self-knowledge, the variety of forms it might take. So I hope you enjoy the show and also question the speakers. Thanks.